Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to Cultural Anthropology. We're going to pick up where we left off. We're going to talk about what cultural anthropologists do, okay? And this is kind of an interesting question because cultural anthropology can be done everywhere, okay? In any job, any profession, cultural anthropology can fit into it. And why? Why is that the case? Well, because it's dealing with people. Anytime that you're dealing with people, a cultural anthropologist can go in there and try and understand. If you have a basic knowledge of what cultural anthropology is, it can help better your interactions with those people, right? So there's lots of stuff that we can do. There are, although, very few jobs that actually call out specifically for a cultural anthropologist. Those jobs are oftentimes things like working in the federal or state governments, maybe working within NGOs, non-governmental organizations, so like charities, stuff like that. Even cultural resource management, which is usually, traditionally done by archaeologists, is becoming more and more a realm where cultural anthropology is starting to fit in, because archaeologists are going out there and they're like, oh, we're gonna dig up the remains of this people that used to live here, right? Their structures, their tools, and the people themselves. But here's the thing, right? Those are the ancestors of somebody. And so what a lot of archaeologists are doing is they're taking on that role of cultural ambassador, right? So understanding cultural anthropology becomes more and more important as you are working with different cultures, trying to not only do what we consider to be right with those remains, returning them to their proper place, to their proper people, but also understanding and treating those people with respect, right? And that's a lot of what we're trying to do, is treating those folks with respect. So, you know, those are just some of those realms, right? Oftentimes the federal governmental side of things. Let's get over here. Different options, though. Actually working with Native American groups as to help maintain, protect, and work as an intermediary between tribal governments, between federal and state governments. So you might actually work for a tribe and help become that sort of ambassador or translator, if you will, between those communities. We find cultural anthropologists oftentimes in the realm of as like medical anthropologists, working in medical institutions, bridging those gaps between practitioners and patients. We see lots of anthropologists going into things like marketing, right? If you can understand the cultural behavior and the buying practices of a group of people, guess what? You're going to figure out how to sell stuff to them, right? So even marketing and business, right, can be a great realm for anthropologists to go into. Understanding corporate culture, right? How to be productive and yet also make your people happy, right? How do you get the most productiveness out of a group of people without burning them out, right? How do you meet their needs so that they can meet your needs? Sounds exploitive, but it is, and it's true. But that's also part of how we understand our own systems, right? And then they work in places like nonprofits, charities, museums, along with those governmental institutions. So those are some of the professions that you might find yourself in. The job of an anthropologist, however, is oftentimes to work within that community. What does that mean? Well, it's oftentimes takes effort and time to learn the characteristics of that community, to be able to learn the skills, the language, of that community. And when I talk about learning the language, it can be pretty dynamic. So that's I'm a cultural anthropologist, but I'm really interested in how mechanic shops work, right? Your car breaks down, and you got to take it to a mechanic shop or garage, and they take your car and then they work on it and get it back to you. Well, there's a culture that is unique to mechanics. So I would go and work with a mechanic. I would shadow them. I would learn what they're doing. I might even work as a mechanic. I might get tools and learn how those tools work, and I would learn the process in which they do this. And then I would also learn the language, the focal language that mechanics use, right? They have to understand how, let's say, the motor works, or how the steering works, or the suspension works. Each one of those things has a specific function, and oftentimes has specific language attached to it. Words that in our normal daily lives as non-mechanics, we don't understand. I don't know what is a trunnion, right? What is a pitman arm, right? We hear those terms and we're like, I don't know what that is. But a mechanic does, right? Because they understand that terminology and how it relates to the suspension and steering. So I would go and I would watch them and I would learn that terminology and I would learn everything that I could about being that mechanic. And then I might go to another mechanic and watch them from a different shop and see how those variations, because not every mechanic shop is going to be the same, to see how it varies between those. So, we can look at local cultures. We don't have to go, huge and broad, but we can look at the very localized things and see how they work. So understanding the language, working within the culture, learning those skills so that you can adequately explain what those things are to people that don't know what those things are, right? And then understanding the contemporary issues and the historical issues, right? What were shops like before and how are they changing now, right? If we're talking about mechanics, we also have to talk about cars. And if we're talking about cars, if you've got a 73 GMC half-ton pickup and then compare it to a Tesla, right? They're both cars, but they are very different. So you're going to have people that understand those two different sides of being a mechanic, right? You're looking at two totally different systems. How are things changing, right? So we would want to understand those things as well. You have to understand what is considered to be that idealized and actual identity. Okay, and this is something that we just sort of touched on before, is that sometimes we have this idealized identity of who we are, right? If we're talking about America, like I'm American, right? And we're taught that this is the greatest country in the world and we are number one and all of those things. That's what we believe, right? We've been taught that our entire lives. Are we the best? Not always. Other places are doing different things that sometimes has better results. And so when we look at idealized identity, we're like, yes, we are the best. And then we look at actual things, it's like, well, yeah, we could improve, right? That happens a lot with culture, right? We have this sense of who we think we are versus what we actually do. And we have this even within our own selves as individuals, right? You might think of yourself as this, but you're actually something slightly different, right? That's that perception of who we are and how we behave. We have to bridge bridge the gap between cultures, theirs and our own. And this is also is typically only accomplished when we understand our own cultural biases, right? If we understand our bias, and this is really important to understand because we'll be talking about cultural bias throughout the semester, both cultural and individual bias. And that's when we are taught something and we believe it, right? And that when we see something that is different, we believe that, our own idea is the right way because we've grown up that way, right? That's always been the case. And when those ideas are challenged, they can be difficult to comprehend or to accept, right? So we develop these biases. Now, here's the thing. We all have bias. It's a part of culture. It's a part of how we grow up, right? So we recognize that we have bias. And then once we recognize those biases, then we can look at other cultures and say, like, I see this. This is interesting and weird to me. I recognize that I have a bias against it or for it. Now that I recognize that I have that bias, I can start looking at it without that bias, right? I can start to separate those things out and try and get a better picture without having that undue influence. So we all have it. We just have to learn to work with it. And I think that's really important to understand. A lot of times when we're working with other cultures and we're trying to either solve problems, we have to listen to what they want and then also look for what they actually need. And this is an interesting question. For example, okay, let's say I'm working with Doctors Without Borders. Okay, and we go to a village, and in this village, there's a lot of sick people. And so me as a doctor, I'm like, all right, we're gonna fix these people up. So you build a clinic, and you get people coming in, and you got medicines and stuff, and you start fixing those people, right? You're getting them healthy. But those people keep getting sick, right? Now, as a doctor, you're using the tools that you have, right? You're looking at the problem and you're creating a solution, through your means. As a cultural anthropologist, I would go in there and say, okay, so I see all these sick people and I see these doctors and they're fixing things, but they're treating the symptoms. They're not actually treating the causes, right? So I want to look for that cause. So, and I'm not saying that doctors don't look for causes. I'm just saying this is the example that I'm using. So I'm going to look for that cause. So I'm going to say, okay, so these people are getting sick. What could be causing that? And I start looking at various things like where are you getting your food? Where are you getting your water? And all of a sudden I figure out, oh, wait, you're getting your water. You're telling me that you've got to walk 8 miles to the well. Right, and then you got to carry that water back another 8 miles so that you can have water in your home. That's a long way to travel to get water. Let's test that water, right? So we test the water, find out water's pretty dirty, right? It's pretty gross. And we're like, oh, that could be the cause of a lot of the illness, right? This water is pretty gross, and they're having to travel 16 miles a day to get that water. Along the way, you've got an increased amount of injuries or the possibility of getting injuries. So what would happen if we were to build a well in town and made sure that it was clean water? So we bring in some engineers, we build a big well, we start pumping out water, the water comes out clean or we make it clean. And all of a sudden, a lot of those symptoms of those illnesses start going away because now you've got clean drinking water. And that clean water can then also be used to irrigate fields with clean water. All of a sudden, you start seeing a lot more healthy people because they've got access to clean water. And so instead of having to necessarily have those Doctors Without Borders, maybe what was really needed was Engineers Without Borders to come in and fix that problem, right? So sometimes that's one of the things that we have to do is look at what's happening and then try and figure out what the actual cause is. And they might be two unrelated things that we have to piece together. Okay, let's keep going. You have to be an ethically bound person, right? You have to be moral and ethically ethical person because you're dealing with people's lives. And one of the things that sometimes happens is that people are exploited, right? Maybe they don't have the technology or the education. People come in and will exploit people. And it happens, and it's terrible when it does. As a cultural anthropologist, you might learn all of the stuff about this community, and you could use that to your or someone else's benefit at the cost of that culture's. Can't do that, right? You can't do that. So you have to be a morally and ethically bound person. Anthropologists also study people and structures of power. Okay, what are those structures of power, right? So we're talking about different things and different societies. A couple of examples, right? We're looking at government, right? Government is a structure of power. Both local, state, and federal structures have a lot of different kinds of power. What else has structural power? Well, we might be looking at like religion, right? Religion is definitely a structure of power and has had lots of influence over our lives. Even if you're not religious, right? Or of a different religion, right? In the United States, we are definitely had a Christian influence in our laws, and we still see that happening even today, in which people are trying to pass laws based off of their religious beliefs. So those things are going to be impacting people of other faith or of no faith, right? That's a structure of power, right? Being able to have that influence. Economics, right? Wealth, right? People who have wealth and people who don't. The poor, right? That's a structure. We can look at military and education as structures of power. And then in each of those, we also have other structures such as race, gender, sexual orientation, class, ethnicity, all have major roles in those structures, right? We're talking about sort of this holistic approach. So if we look at holistic approaches here, how does religion influence government? How does religion influence economic status or the military or education? And then in each of those, how does race fit in? How does gender fit in, right? All of those things, as an individual person, you're going to experience differently than someone else, you know, because they might look different than you. They might come from a different part of the country than you. They might be of a different sexual orientation, or they might be on a different gender spectrum than you are. It's all different, and it impacts people differently. So we try and understand those things. Okay, we're going to end that section, and then we'll jump into the next more historical aspect of anthropology. Okay, we will see you in a few.